This is FE Peer Review. The date is March the 27th, 2025. How I use Sketchup's field of view and camera tool in my videos. Back on December 31st, I put out a little video discussing the shadows that were seen in the live streams of the final experiment in Antarctica. I made a little SketchUp model and showed what's going on with shadows in perspective and how they can be distorted depending on what the field of view of the image is. I got a comment. Somebody wrote a comment here, Nunia B. I'm curious, what field of view setting did you enter for the scene with the two tables? And I used 35 degrees. And I thought that might make a good little subject for a video of its own, how that works in SketchUp, because I don't know if it's necessarily exactly parallel to or exactly the same as to what goes on with cameras and lenses. So let's take a look at that briefly. I'm going to start by saying I am far from an expert with regard to photography and lenses. So what I have to say about field of view is specifically with regard to how it's used in architectural perspective drawing and how it's used in SketchUp, which is built on the tradition of architectural drawing. But I did want to touch on cameras and lenses a bit. There are a few people that have done nice videos on the subject. I think Bob the Science Guy has covered it pretty well. I think there were some others that talked about it as well. So if you want to see more about that, I encourage you to go to their channels. What we're seeing in this image here is two types of distortion that are common in camera lenses: barrel distortion and pin cushion distortion. So the grid that's overlaid on each of these images shows, kind of graphs out how the distortion is happening. What you see is in the middle of the frame, there's the least amount of distortion. This rectangle here is the closest to being a rectangle with right angles at the corners. Whereas as you move towards the edge of the frame, go up to the corners, you see that the shapes are no longer rectangular, the angles are no longer 90 degrees. So that indicates how much of distortion you're experiencing. And it's typical that there's the least amount of distortion in the center of the frame and the most around the edges. How much there is depends on the field of view. And the field of view itself depends on the lens that you're using. The design of camera lenses is even further from my area of expertise, but I just thought I'd include this pretty little picture. You know, you can go as far down that rabbit hole as you want. There's a lot to know. Some lenses can be quite a wide-angled lens where you would expect a lot of distortion, but because of careful design of the lens, they're able to reduce that to a minimum, whereas other lenses with the same wide angle, the same field of view, might well have quite a bit more distortion. Then there's also the rabbit hole of antique lenses. This is a specialty antique camera lens that allows you to, here's the lens itself over here, and you can see that it is above the center of the photographic plate, which is in the box on the right. You can slide this up and down, which changes the center of the lens relative to the center of the photographic plate. You can also tilt it. This picture doesn't show it tilted, but you can tilt it this way, you can tilt it that way. So these antique lenses were designed so that you could kind of undo some of the perspective distortion. That's all a really cool subject, and in fact I recently bought myself one of these, but I have to restore it and learn how to use it, and that's rather time consuming. Something I'm going to have to get to soon, I hope. Okay, I mentioned architectural photography there for a minute, where these two subjects begin to overlap, and I wanted to share this image with you, which shows a very common problem in architectural photography. This is a view of two patio doors. You can see that the patio door openings are almost square. They're a little bit higher than they are wide, but they're pretty nearly square. And the doors themselves, however, appear quite distorted. If you look at the door on the far right, it's way out at the edge of the frame where there's liable to be the most distortion. And if you look at the width of that door, it looks like that door would fill in well more than half the patio door opening. And yet we know that the door on the right and the door on the left of the opening are really the same size. And when they're closed up side by side, they'd meet right in the middle. But because of the constraints of photographing a space in a constrained interior space like this, you have to use a very wide-angle lens, and that wide-angle lens introduces a lot of distortion around the edges of the image. This is very common in architectural photography, and I find it sometimes a bit annoying. Looking at the floor, which is a square tile format of floor, we can see again that the tiles sort of closest to the center of the frame appear closest to being square, whereas as we move towards the lower corners at the left and the right, we can see that a lot of distortion is introduced into the proportions of those square tiles. So we try, when we're using things like SketchUp, to be conscious of that and minimize the effects. It's all about field of view, and I found on archive.org this lovely old architectural drawing textbook from about, I think it was 1922 that it was published. It has this plate here which shows the basics of a perspective drawing. We've got a little block, some kind of a brick or something, and he's showing how the setup is done. The key part of the image is here in the center of the frame, and I've got a close-up of that. Our little rectangular block that we want to draw in perspective is shown at the top here. This is an orthographic view looking down from the top, a plan view. Orthographic, drawn to scale. So the first step is to define what's called a picture plane, and that's this horizontal line that passes through the middle of the image. Traditionally, you had your picture plane touch the object you're going to draw at least at one point, sometimes more than one point depending, but oftentimes it was this front corner. And that gives you a scale to work with. Your orthographic scale matches your perspective drawing at the point where this picture plane line intersects your object. So at this corner here, when we turn this into a vertical image and we're looking at it from the ground in perspective, that point at the corner is where the two things match, the orthographic scale and the perspective drawing. The next step after that is to establish your station point. That's this S down here. And that needs to be some distance away. If you put it very close, you end up with a very wide field of view, which gives you the kind of distortion we just saw in that photograph of the patio doors. So you want to pull it back far enough away that your field of view, that your object doesn't occupy too much of a field of view. That's your way of reducing the distortion. Now, depending on what you're trying to convey in the drawing, you may not be able to go back more than that. You may have things in front of the house you want to show. In that case, you may need to go further back. But you don't want to go so far back either. I mean, you want to find a sweet spot where it allows you to see the house nice and up and close, but without a lot of distortion due to too wide of a field of view. I've traced a couple of lines here, a couple of pairs of lines. I put a green dot up here, and that was like you might say, well, is this a good spot to set my station point up? You're laying out your perspective drawing, and you look, and you find that your field of view here, the angle there is quite wide. It looks like it's about a 60 to 70 degree angle. So you say, no, that's probably going to look kind of distorted. So you come back a ways and you choose this spot and you look at the angle there between the two red lines, and that's a much narrower angle. That looks like a good place to work from. I was trained to aim for about 45 degrees. Typically with 45 degrees as your field of view, you're not going to get distortion that would be noticeable or disturbing. When you start getting past 60, it starts to become really noticeable and kind of weird. I want to show one more thing here. This pair of cyan lines. So what I've done when I put these cyan lines is I made them parallel to the green lines. So if you were standing at your more distant point and you took a very wide field of view for your image, you could capture stuff around the far left and the far right of the frame, which you might want to have in order to provide more context. And we're going to see that when we move over to the SketchUp drawings that I'm going to share with you. If there are things like trees and bushes, landscape elements where the distortion isn't obvious because you don't have a lot of straight lines and right angles, then you might want to take that field of view and allow yourself to widen it. Okay, now let's head over to SketchUp. Here's a little project I'm working on at the moment. It's a small house based on a historical house from the turn of the 1900s that was designed for a site in Southern California, but the house was never built. The design was never executed. So I'm taking those designs and I'm updating them to fit with modern building codes. and modern expectations, things such as having more than one bathroom and decent sized closets. Anyway, what we're seeing here, this exterior view has a field of view of 45 degrees. Now, if you look at the bottom right corner of the screen, you'll see it says field of view 45 degrees. I set that myself. I chose that field of view because I found it to be a view that gave me enough context around the house and didn't introduce a lot of distortion into the image. I could have changed that. I could have made it a wider field of view. I'll show you 60-degree field of view. So now I get more context. To be clear, I'm standing in exactly the same spot in the model, but I'm simply allowing myself to see farther on each side of me. That's the 60-degree field of view. I will increase that some more. There's 75. Now there are reasons you might want to do that. If the focus is on the exterior surroundings, on the landscape, for example, if this was a landscape design that I was doing and that was what I wanted to express to the client, then I might decide this is the way to go. But for my purposes, which was to focus on the building, I found that a 45-degree field of view worked nicely, gave me a nice balance. Strictly speaking, yes, there will be distortion in the image at even 45 degrees. And if I had set it to say 30 degrees, there'd be less distortion. Let's take a look at what happens when I go to 30 degrees. If you really were to compare this image to a orthographic image and the actual dimensions of the building, you'll find there's less distortion. But as you can see at this point from this particular location, the house no longer fits in the frame of the image. So we're missing pieces which the client's going to want to see. Now I could pull my position further back and keep this 30-degree field of view. So now I've moved further back into the street and I'm looking back at the house with a 30-degree field of view. And yes, there is a little less distortion in this image compared to the previous one. And I might have wanted to use that if I was really concerned about the distortion. But the fact is the other image worked fine and I didn't need to have all of that street and sidewalk as a part of my picture. So this is what I chose. When you're working outside of a house like this, it's quite flexible. You can manipulate it a lot. There's a lot of things you can do without it causing a problem, particularly if you've got those landscape elements around the edges of the image rather than other rectilinear objects, because then the distortion, like I mentioned before, isn't so noticeable. Where it gets tricky is when you move inside the house, because you're constrained as far as how much space you have to work with. You can only move around so much, and you want to provide a sense of the three-dimensional experience inside. So let's go inside here. First, we're going to make our way up to the front door. We're approaching the front door here, and if you're really paying close attention, you'll note that I've already adjusted the field of view to 60 degrees. I've allowed it to get wider, and the reason I did that because I wanted to get more of a sense of the containment of the trellised walkway we're walking under, a feeling that you're surrounded by the structure. Having that wider field of view kind of emphasized that aspect. Now we're going to go inside the front entrance hall. We're inside the front hall now, and again I've set the field of view to 60 degrees. I've got the door right to my back. If I try to back up at all, I'm going to be hitting the door, which isn't going to work for this particular view. We've got an entrance hall. On the right, we've got a little alcove that has a coat closet and a powder room. Straight ahead stairs going upstairs to the bedroom level. A door to the kitchen, which is open, so you can see through. You know, if you've got a lot of dirty dishes in the sink, you might want to close the door. And to the left, an arched opening that leads into the living room. At 60 degrees field of view, we can get all of that into the frame quite nicely, but we do start to see some distortion. I would say that the arch on the left looks a bit odd, not very clear. Let's see what happens when we change this to 30 degrees. As you can see, we miss out on the material that was around us, which was important to the scene. You know, when you think about how you move about in everyday life, this is part of the challenge. We're constantly moving. Our eyes are constantly moving. Our heads are moving. We don't see things in fixed images. We see, we gather a full 3D perception, and our brains kind of stitch it all together instantaneously to give us a full sense of our surroundings. And this is something that you can't do when you're converting camera images onto a flat screen. Something else I'll point out, which is whenever we look at any picture on the internet, we're not seeing what people saw. When those people went down to Antarctica at the final experiment, they saw Antarctica. What they showed us was pictures taken by cameras. So inevitably, the distortion introduced by the cameras, well, it's inevitable. There's no way around it. There's no way to convey what their eyeballs see directly onto the screens of our computers. They have to take pictures. They have to upload the pictures onto the internet. So there's always going to be a break between what we really see with our eyes and what our cameras can see. So if we're conscious of that, we can plan for it. We can understand it. We can minimize the problems. We can account for the problems it creates. They had those amazing 360 cameras that they used, and they provide fantastic imagery, but they distort things inevitably. And that's what got the flat earthers all freaked out with the shadows. They didn't understand that the lenses were of a type that are going to cause distortion. They know that it doesn't match what they think they'd see if they were down there, and that's true. What they don't get is that we're looking through a camera, and it's inevitable that the camera is going to affect what we see. So go there and look with your own eyes, bring your 360 camera and compare what it shows you to what you saw with your own eyes. And then it'll make sense. The camera is recording as best it can what it sees, and it's up to us to have the knowledge how to interpret and analyze the data it's giving us. Okay, enough of that aside. So we're looking in the front entrance, and it's a 60-degree view, and we're going to turn and make our way towards the living room. Again, we've got a 60-degree view, and we're looking into the living room now. I wanted a 60-degree view because I wanted to get the sense of that archway that we're going to walk through as we enter the living room. Here's what it would look like with a 30-degree view. We lose the arch pretty much entirely. You can actually see the edges of it around at each edge of the frame, but there's not enough there to be clear what we're actually looking at. And I can't back up much more or I run into the wall behind me. It's like I can back up a little bit. But I didn't want to switch from 60 to 30 to 68 repeatedly either, because that looks kind of weird when you do the images as a video, which we'll see at the end, as a continuous stream, which you'll see at the end. So here we are looking in at 60 degrees. We can move in a little more. Still at 60 degrees. We're going to make our way over to the window facing us. We're going to turn around and we're going to look back. And you're going to look back towards the arch we came through. You're going to see that it looks rather distorted. So we're looking back to where we came from. On our left is the dining area with the patio door to the back, and on our right is the arch that we came through. Now that archway is actually a semicircle, but in this image it looks like an ellipse. And that's because it's so near the edge of the frame. And so that's the kind of distortion that gets introduced, and that can sometimes trip a client up. A client might see this image and think that the arch from the entry to the living room is elliptical. And so I would need to explain that that's just a factor in the limitation of the software and in the limitation of perspective drawing. There are some clever techniques. Maybe I'll do an image. I'll show you one after to kind of help again to reduce some of that. But first I want to move through and around the corner and into the kitchen, and you'll see as we do that this archway actually is semicircular. I'm going to move over just a little bit. And there you can see the arch nicely, and that it's a half circle, not an ellipse. Back to where we were. We're looking into the kitchen now, and I'm still using that same 60-degree field of view. We're going to walk over closer to the kitchen and keep it. Now we're looking into the kitchen with the 60-degree field of view, and at this point 60 degrees is, pretty much the limit as far as how much distortion you can normally tolerate. But on rare occasions it's sometimes worth going further, so I'm going to increase it to 75. And this allows us to feel like we're a little more deeply into the kitchen, and we're definitely going to get distortion to the proportions of things. But when you're dealing with a really confined space, you sometimes will want to do that. There's one other thing I think I'll touch on here that has to do with how you set up a convincing looking interior perspective in SketchUp, and that's the convergence or divergence of lines vertically. So SketchUp is giving us what we would call a 3-point perspective. Traditionally, architectural drawings done by hand were done with just a 2-point perspective. The horizontal lines converged to 2 vanishing points on the horizon, but the vertical lines were drawn parallel, directly perpendicular, straight up and down. And that just simplified the whole process of creating an architectural perspective quite a lot. Let me introduce one of those pictures and show that. So here's a bunch of images of 2-point perspectives. We'll take this one up here. We see that there's one point on the left here, and these wall lines converge to that point. And then somewhere off to the right, there's another point where these wall lines converge. So that's our second point. But the vertical lines are all parallel and don't converge up or down. In reality, we see convergence in all 3 axes, X, Y, and Z. But a 2-point perspective simplifies the drawing convention so that we only do 2 points, and it makes it a lot easier to do the drawing. It's an interesting thing because people have become so accustomed to seeing 2-point perspectives that we don't register the fact that it's actually a distortion of what we see in nature, in reality. We've just gotten so accustomed to it that we don't notice it. But like if you look at this setup here of this image of the living room, you'll see on the right-hand side, the right side of the arch, the jamb of the opening is slightly not parallel to the edge of the frame. And SketchUp always works in a 3-point perspective. In fact, I kind of wish they would offer an option that allowed you to do a 2-point. What I have to do in order to kind of make this look realistic the way people expect it to be is adjust my eye level I'm going to improve on slightly on the way I had it. Now if you look out the patio door on the left, you'll see horizontal line right across there. That's the horizon, so that's my eye level. And I want to try to set that to approximately where standing height of a person would be. And then I'm going to adjust my tilt. Notice the right side here, the jamb of the arched opening. I'm going to play with that a little bit. You see my eye level's going up. I'm actually getting, my head is getting closer to the ceiling, and though that line's getting out of parallel with the edge of the image. Now there it's parallel. The edge is parallel with the edge of the frame. And my eye level, if we look at the horizon out here outside the patio door, we'll see that's pretty near. It's a little on the low side, but it's pretty near a person's standing eye level. I've got it about halfway between standing and sitting, which is probably a good place for this view. So now I've got the verticals as close to vertical as I can manage it by hand here. And that makes it look a little more like what we would actually experience if we were walking through the space, moving through the space. You know, if you wanted to convey something dramatic and interesting, you might do that. But realistically, you're not going to see that view unless you're on a ladder replacing a light bulb. Or conversely, you might do the opposite, you know, and make a big deal out of the fireplace. Looks like a fireplace is 8 feet tall. It's not. It's a normal-sized fireplace. Occasionally, there's a reason to mess with that kind of thing, and I'll show you. One would be, for example, if you're trying to explain the staircase to a client. We've got the staircase here. If I do it at eye level, that's all right. You know, that gives some idea of the flow of the staircase, but I might want to go in here and do as if I'm looking up, like I'm getting ready to walk up the stairs. So now I can see that the stairs continues and wraps around going up like that. So those are ways to manipulate the vertical in the imagery. But I find that the most convincing interior images happen when I keep my verticals close to... See, I've lost it again. Let me try this one more time. It can be a bit tricky to set up. Try to keep my verticals close to parallel to the edges of the frame. So that's the last that I wanted to say about that. I wanted to show you one other little trick that can be useful, but it's not used very much. And that's to combine perspective views with section cuts of a building. So I'm just going to go ahead and set it up. I have not set this up in advance, so it's going to take me a moment. I may speed this part of the video up, so I'm not going to narrate for the time being. Okay, so what I've done here is I have cut a section through the model. I didn't erase anything. I just made a section cut, so all that other stuff is still saved. But we can now like slice away the front wall of the house and look inside. And now I can set up a view of the interior because I no longer have to back up. You know, when you're inside the space, you can only back up so much before you bump into the wall behind you. And so this takes the wall behind me away and allows me to look into the inside. Now, if I do this right, my current field of view is 60 degrees. And let's say I wanted to try 35. But it pulled me in. It kind of gives me the sense of being further into the room. And I'd like to show the whole room. So now I can back up away. And now we see that I've kind of like stepped outside and I'm looking in through the wall and the wall is invisible. I've got these plants from outside. I'm going to turn that off. And now we're seeing a view of the interior that is going to be less distorted because it's a narrower field of view, and yet we still get to see pretty much the whole room here. That's a 35-degree field of view. I'll return to 60. Go to 75. You can see that there's quite a bit more distortion. There's 30. I'm going to rotate around a little bit and get that dining room area there. So that's another little technique. Combining a section cut with a perspective view can be quite fun and useful. It's also a nice way to show the relationship of different spaces, which takes me to the last picture I'm going to share with you here. And that'll just give you a little glimpse of the floor plan because you're probably wondering what's going on with this house. So there's our ground floor. The entrance is on the right side where I'm circling the mouse. We came in through the trellis. I've cut this away so you're not seeing the trellis, but that was where we walked up to the front door, stepped into the front hall here. The staircase was in front of us and we could see through back to the kitchen. Turning to our left, we went into the living room, and then around to the dining area and through into the kitchen. From the kitchen, we could circle back around to the front. We've got the powder room to the right of the front door and a little coat closet, and then the stairs leading up. From the dining room, we can step out the back patio door onto this little back terrace, which also has a trellis, which you don't see here. And going around to our right, there's a staircase going up. That's an exterior stair. This space on the far right is a single-car garage, and it has a flat roof which serves as a terrace for the upper level. And this staircase takes you up there. Now we'll go up to the second floor. To the first floor for my European friends and the second floor for my Americans. Here we see the second floor. The staircase comes up. There's a small central hall. Doors leading to the 2 bedrooms that face the front of the house. They share a bathroom. And then straight ahead from the stairs, there's another bedroom, larger bedroom with a dressing room and its own bathroom here. And here you can see the trellises over the back terrace and the front terrace. So the front terrace is not accessible from inside the house. You have to go out to the back garden and go up the staircase from outside. But it's part of the garden. It's part of the exterior space. That was the idea. So those are the plans. I've got a couple of nice little videos that I've got done about 3 minutes long in total, a little less than that, which I'll run now with some music to keep you company. You don't need to hear my voice droning on anymore. But I'll mention right now, if you enjoyed this video, please remember to give it a thumbs up, a comment, subscribe, all those things. And I wish you a very pleasant day.